In the sweltering heat of August 1892, the town of Fall River, Massachusetts, bustled with the quiet rhythms of New England life. A town built on the backs of mill workers and old money, Fall River was a place where respectability mattered, where neighbors kept watchful eyes, and where routine was both a comfort and a law. Among its more prominent families were the Bordens, wealthy, private, and by all accounts, peculiar in their ways. At the head of the household stood Andrew Borden, a successful but notoriously frugal businessman, his second wife Abby, and his two adult daughters, Emma and Lizzie. They lived in a modest two-story home on 2nd Street. Despite Andrew's considerable fortune, which many believed could have afforded them a far grander estate on the more fashionable side of town. To the outside world, the Borden family seemed well established, even enviable. But within the walls of their home, tensions simmered. Andrew's rigid control over the household finances, his marriage to Abby, whom the Borden daughters reportedly never accepted, and the strict routines enforced in the home had created an atmosphere that felt less like a family residence and more like a prison of unresolved resentment. Lizzie, in particular, was known to be willful, deeply religious, and increasingly reclusive. She was involved in church activities and local charities, but neighbors would note she rarely smiled, and her relationship with Abby was strained to the point of cold detachment. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, Fall River would awaken to the kind of news that turned quiet towns into cautionary tales. Just before noon, the household's maid, Bridget Sullivan, an Irish immigrant employed by the Bordens, screamed out into the street that Mr. Borden had been killed. Police rushed to the scene and found Andrew Borden sprawled on the sitting room couch, his face hacked beyond recognition, blood still soaking into the carpet below. Not long after, they discovered the body of Abby Borden in the upstairs guest room. She had been murdered even more viciously, struck repeatedly in the back of the head and neck with a sharp-bladed instrument. The walls and floor around her were stained with dark, drying blood. The town was in an uproar. Double murders were almost unheard of in Fall River, and the sheer brutality of the crimes, committed in broad daylight in a respectable home, unsettled the entire community. Newspapers from Boston to New York quickly caught wind of the story, their headlines growing more lurid by the hour. Neighbors gathered in tight clusters on sidewalks, exchanging theories in hushed tones. Who could have committed such an atrocity, and why? Suspicion quickly turned inward. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear motive for a robbery gone wrong, and little evidence of anyone fleeing the scene. The Borden house had remained locked during the hours in which the murders were believed to have occurred, and most damning of all, only 3 people were believed to have been home during the time: Andrew, Abby, and Lizzie. Lizzie's demeanor following the discovery of the bodies only deepened the mystery. Calm, composed, and oddly emotionless, she answered police questions with a coolness that unsettled even seasoned officers. Her story of being in the barn loft looking for sinkers for a fishing trip strained credulity in her behavior. Burning a dress days after the murders, for instance, added fuel to already rampant speculation. While she never confessed, nor was she caught with a weapon, the lack of other viable suspects made her the primary focus of the investigation. For Fall River, the murders shattered a sense of communal safety. If such horror could unfold in a well-to-do home on a quiet street, who was truly safe? Whispers filled church pews and grocery shops alike, and Lizzie Borden's name began to carry with it an air of darkness and scandal. As the days wore on and details emerged, the town's fascination deepened into obsession, and what began as a local tragedy quickly grew into a national spectacle. The brutal end of Andrew and Abby Borden not only changed the lives of those involved, it altered the very fabric of Fall River's identity, casting a long, blood-stained shadow that would never fully lift. In the days following the gruesome murders of Andrew and Abby Borden, as the town of Fall River swelled with suspicion and dread, the spotlight began to fix itself more firmly on Lizzie Borden. The idea that a well-bred, church-going woman could take up a hatchet and slaughter her father and stepmother was unthinkable to many. But it was precisely this incongruity that made the suspicion stick. The police, though initially hesitant to cast blame on a woman of her social standing, soon found themselves circling back to Lizzie with increasing intensity. From the beginning, Lizzie's account of her whereabouts on the morning of the murders was marked by inconsistencies. She first claimed to have been ironing handkerchiefs in the kitchen. Later, she insisted she'd gone out to the barn to find lead sinkers for an upcoming fishing trip. Officers who examined the barn, however, found thick dust undisturbed on the floor and no clear signs of recent activity. The oppressive August heat made it difficult to believe she had spent any significant amount of time there, certainly not the 20 to 30 minutes she suggested. Her shifting story raised eyebrows, not just among investigators, but within the community as well. Lizzie's behavior during the immediate aftermath of the murders also seemed strangely detached. Rather than appearing distraught, witnesses noted that she was composed, even cool. She offered her version of events without being asked, in a manner that seemed rehearsed. When asked if she had any idea who could have done such a thing, she casually mentioned a mysterious visitor who might have come to seek revenge on Andrew for some business dealing, an answer that felt more like misdirection than insight. There were no signs of such a visitor, and neighbors had seen no strangers in the area that morning. Adding to the air of suspicion was the long-standing tension between Lizzie and her stepmother. Though Abby had been in the family since Lizzie was a young child, Lizzie refused to refer to her as Mother, opting instead for the coldly formal Mrs. Borden. Friends reported that the relationship had grown particularly strained in the months leading up to the murders. Disputes over inheritance, particularly a property gift Andrew had made to Abby's relatives, had driven a deeper wedge between the two women. In fact, in the week before the killings, Lizzie and her sister Emma had even taken extended stays away from the house, an escape from what Lizzie once called a prison of spite. There were also troubling details surrounding a mysterious incident involving prussic acid, a deadly poison. Just days before the murders, Lizzie was reported to have tried to purchase the substance at a local drugstore. She claimed it was for cleaning a sealskin cape, but the pharmacist refused the sale. Though this incident never made it into the courtroom during her trial due to a judge's ruling, it circulated widely in the press and added to the growing narrative that Lizzie may have been plotting something sinister long before that bloody morning. Perhaps the most damning detail, however, came after the murders, when Lizzie was seen burning a blue dress in the kitchen stove. When questioned, she claimed the dress had been stained with paint. But to the police it seemed possible, even likely, that the garment had been splattered with blood, and the burning was an attempt to destroy evidence. With no other suspects, no clear motive for an outsider to have committed the crimes, and Lizzie's story riddled with contradictions, public suspicion deepened. Despite these alarming facts, there remained a core group of people in Fall River who stood by Lizzie. They found it impossible to believe that a refined, unmarried woman from such a respectable family could commit such a heinous act. Others were not so convinced. The Borden murders had cracked open not just the sanctity of a home, but the illusion that morality and femininity were always entwined. Lizzie became a mirror in which the anxieties of the Victorian age about women, class, and control were projected. As the evidence piled up, the police felt they could no longer ignore the possibility that Lizzie was not a grieving daughter, but a cold-blooded killer. The suspicion had ripened into action, and on August 11th, 1892, just 1 week after the murders, Lizzie Borden was arrested and charged with the murders of her father and stepmother. The horror discovered inside the Borden home on August 4th, 1892, was not only brutal, it was profoundly unsettling in its intimacy. Andrew Borden's body was found first, sprawled on a Victorian settee in the sitting room, his skull caved in, his face virtually obliterated by repeated blows. Blood had pooled beneath his head, soaking into the upholstery and staining the floorboards. One eye had been split cleanly in two by a sharp instrument, likely a hatchet, delivered with such force and repetition that it suggested something far more personal than a robbery gone wrong. Not long after, a more grisly discovery was made upstairs. Abby Borden lay face down in the guest bedroom, her hair matted with blood, a deep gash revealing exposed bone and brain matter. She had been struck from behind, once initially and then again and again, for a total of 19 times, long after she would have been dead. There were no signs of forced entry into the home, no evidence that anything had been stolen, and the layout of the house, with its multiple locks, compartmentalized rooms, and narrow stairways, made it incredibly difficult for an outsider to navigate unnoticed. The Borden home was tightly sealed, almost fortress-like in its privacy. The fact that 2 murders could occur in separate rooms within a relatively small time window in broad daylight, with no one hearing a single scream or seeing a suspicious figure enter or flee, made the crime feel more calculated than spontaneous. For investigators, the lack of disturbance pointed to one chilling conclusion. The killer had likely been someone inside the house. Police quickly began to reconstruct the timeline. Abby Borden, they concluded, had been killed first, probably between 9 o'clock and 9:30 a.m., while Lizzie claimed to have been downstairs. Her father returned home shortly after 10:30 a.m., by which time Abby was already dead upstairs, though Andrew had apparently not noticed. Around 11:10 a.m., Andrew was murdered as he lay resting on the couch. Bridget Sullivan, the maid, was allegedly in her attic room, resting after being asked to wash the windows on a sweltering day. If her account was truthful, she had heard nothing of the attacks until Lizzie called out to her saying Andrew had been hurt. Even more perplexing was the conspicuous absence of blood evidence. The murders were messy, ferocious, and would almost certainly have resulted in the killer being drenched in gore. Yet Lizzie's clothing appeared spotless. She wore a clean dress when the police arrived, and there were no bloodstains on her hands or face. This led to speculation. Could she have committed the murders in a different outfit, one she later disposed of? Witnesses later claimed she burned a dress in the stove a few days after the killings, claiming it had been stained with paint. The authorities, however, wondered if it had been soaked with something far more incriminating. The weapon itself also became a focus of investigation. In the basement of the Borden home, police discovered several axes and hatchets. One in particular drew their attention, a hatchet with a freshly broken handle and a clean, dust-free head, as though it had been recently wiped. Though it could not be definitively proven to be the murder weapon, its suspicious condition raised questions. If it wasn't the tool used in the killings, why was it the only one that appeared tampered with? The autopsies, conducted hastily and under primitive conditions, only added to the grim narrative. After an initial examination at the scene, the bodies of Andrew and Abby were buried, only to be exhumed days later for further study. Their heads were removed, boiled to strip them of flesh, and then presented as evidence. Lizzie, reportedly unaware of this detail, fainted in court upon seeing the skulls of her father and stepmother displayed during her trial, a moment that would later be interpreted by some as genuine horror and by others as well-timed theatrics. Despite all the circumstantial evidence pointing toward Lizzie, no clear motive was ever established beyond family discord and resentment. There was no definitive proof, no eyewitness, no confession, no bloodied clothing, and no weapon definitively linked to her. The crime scene was both glaring in its brutality and frustratingly vague in its clues, as if the killer had been methodical enough to destroy or conceal critical evidence before help arrived. What remained was a scene frozen in silence and savagery, where two lives had been ended in a frenzy of violence, and the truth seemed to vanish into the walls of the very home that had held the secrets. By the time Lizzie Borden was brought to trial in June of 1893, the nation was transfixed. The case had exploded beyond the confines of Fall River, making its way into the parlors and headlines of every major city in America. It had all the elements of a captivating drama: brutal murder, family dysfunction, wealth, class tensions, and a female defendant who defied the period's expectations of femininity. Lizzie wasn't just standing trial for murder. She was, in many ways, on trial for what society believed a woman could or could not be capable of. Held in New Bedford, the trial lasted just over 2 weeks, but was packed with enough intrigue to keep journalists busy for months. The courtroom was filled daily with reporters, curious spectators, and society women who came not just to observe justice, but to gawk at the woman in the center of it all. Lizzie, always neatly dressed in high collars and black gowns, sat with a stoic expression, flanked by her defense team and her older sister, Emma. Her composure rarely cracked, though observers differed in interpreting it. Some saw it as the grace of a wrongly accused woman, others as the chilling calm of someone hiding a dark truth. The prosecution's case focused heavily on circumstantial evidence. They emphasized Lizzie's inconsistent statements to police, her apparent lack of grief, the strange timing of her errands, and the burning of the dress. They argued that she had the motive, animosity toward her stepmother, and frustration over inheritance disputes. They suggested that Lizzie waited until Bridget was outside washing windows, struck Abby upstairs, then calmly waited until her father returned, murdering him as he rested on the couch. The idea of premeditation was subtle, but ever present, casting her as someone who may have simmered with resentment for years before finally snapping. One of the more controversial decisions by the court was the exclusion of the prussic acid testimony. The druggist who claimed Lizzie had tried to buy poison days before the murders was not allowed to testify. The judge ruled it too speculative, too loosely connected to the crime. That ruling alone removed a potential pillar of the prosecution's case, and with it, a chance to suggest Lizzie had planned to kill long before the hatchet ever swung. The defense, led by former Massachusetts Governor George D. Robinson, was sharp, experienced, and methodical. They played on the era's deeply entrenched ideas about womanhood. Could a proper lady from a devout household, active in charity and church work, really be capable of such monstrous acts? They highlighted the lack of physical evidence. No blood on Lizzie, no fingerprints, no witness to the crime, no definitive murder weapon. If she had committed the murders, they argued, how had she done so without leaving a trace? Where had she hidden her bloody clothing? How had she disposed of the hatchet? They also suggested that someone else could have entered the home, perhaps a vagrant, a disgruntled former employee, or someone unknown to the family. The fact that Fall River police had done a poor job of securing the crime scene, allowing curious neighbors to wander in and out, further weakened the investigation's reliability. There were suggestions that Bridget, the maid, had perhaps heard more than she admitted, but no solid accusations were made. Perhaps most powerful was the unspoken argument made every time Lizzie walked into the courtroom. She simply didn't look like a killer. She was small, pale, and quiet. She carried a Bible. She avoided eye contact. For a jury of 12 men raised in a culture that idealized women as delicate, moral, and incapable of real violence, this visual contrast to the brutal crime was hard to reconcile. On June 20th, 1893, after just over an hour of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Not guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Lizzie is said to have collapsed into a chair, overcome with emotion. For some, justice had been served. For others, it was a stark reminder that appearances and social standing could outweigh reason. The trial was over, but the public's obsession with Lizzie Borden and the questions left unanswered was just beginning. When the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on June 20th, 1893, a hush fell over the courtroom, quickly followed by a collective gasp. Lizzie Borden, pale and tense, broke down in tears, clinging to her defense team. The sensational trial that had gripped the nation for months had reached its dramatic conclusion. Legally, Lizzie Borden was a free woman, cleared of the brutal killings of her father and stepmother. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict did little to wash away the stain of suspicion that had clung to her name from the very beginning. The trial had been a media frenzy, covered in obsessive detail by newspapers across the country. Court sketches of Lizzie's stoic expressions and testimonies recounted with dramatic flair filled front pages. Her appearance, demeanor, and every word were dissected endlessly. For many Americans, the trial became more than just a criminal proceeding. It became a morality play, a twisted reflection of Victorian society's anxieties about gender, privilege, and violence. The prosecution had leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence. Lizzie's inconsistent statements, the tension in the household, the mysterious burning of the dress, the implausible alibi. But the defense, led by former Massachusetts Governor George D. Robinson, countered with a skillful blend of legal precision and emotional appeal. They painted Lizzie as a demure, wrongfully accused woman, a victim of prejudice and gossip. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence. No bloody clothes were ever recovered. No murder weapon definitively linked to her, and no witness placed her at the scene during the exact time of either murder. The defense argued that the sheer brutality of the crime made it unlikely a woman of Lizzie's stature and character could have committed it. This strategy worked, at least in the courtroom. The all-male jury, products of their time and cultural context, may have struggled to envision a young unmarried woman from a church-going household as capable of such savagery. It's likely that societal perceptions of femininity and propriety created a blind spot in their assessment. A woman was not supposed to be violent, let alone capable of wielding a hatchet with enough rage to deliver dozens of blows. But outside the courtroom, skepticism persisted. Many in Fall River and beyond believed that Lizzie had gotten away with murder. Whispers followed her wherever she went. She had gone into court in dignified black, the picture of mourning, but to many onlookers her behavior had been too composed, her tears too sparse. Reporters noted her occasional smiles, her exchanges with friends in the gallery, even moments of calm detachment. To the growing legion of skeptics, it was all too calculated, too distant from the image of a daughter mourning her brutally slain parents. In Fall River, Lizzie returned to a house divided, both figuratively and literally. She and her sister Emma inherited their father's estate, and eventually moved into a larger home on the fashionable hill section of town, which they named Maplecroft. Lizzie began calling herself Lizbeth, perhaps an attempt to distance herself from the shadow of her old identity. But the name change did little to sway public sentiment. She was ostracized by her church and snubbed by neighbors. Even store clerks were rumored to have turned their backs when she walked in. Children skipped rope to a dark rhyme. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. Her acquittal might have absolved her in the eyes of the law, but the public had written its own verdict. Emma, ever loyal in the beginning, eventually grew distant from her sister. In 1905, she abruptly moved out of Maplecroft without explanation, never to reconcile with Lizzie. Some speculate that Emma had learned something, perhaps a secret she could no longer ignore. Others believed the constant pressure and scrutiny had finally eroded even their sisterly bond. Lizzie, now isolated, filled her days with theater pets and the few friends who remained willing to associate with her. Despite her wealth and freedom, she lived the rest of her life on the fringes, a free woman shackled by whispers. Even in death, Lizzie's reputation remained haunted by doubt. When she passed away in 1927 at the age of 66, newspapers once again resurrected the old headlines, the courtroom sketches, the bloodied crime scene. She was buried beside her father and stepmother in Fall River's Oak Grove Cemetery, 3 names forever bound by suspicion and silence. Long after the gavel fell in the Fall River courtroom, the legend of Lizzie Borden refused to rest. What had begun as a grisly double homicide transformed into a cultural obsession, one that would stretch far beyond the borders of Massachusetts and the bounds of her lifetime. The macabre fascination with Lizzie was not just about the brutal deaths of Andrew and Abby Borden. It was about the eerie possibility that evil could wear the face of a Sunday school teacher, that violence could emerge from within the walls of a well-kept home, and that justice might be clouded by social expectations rather than hard evidence. As years passed, the unanswered questions surrounding the murders only grew more tantalizing. Who, if not Lizzie, could have committed such a crime in a locked house in the middle of the day with no trace of escape? Why did the killer choose a method so violent, so personal, as if it were driven by more than just cold intent? And what was the motive? Money, hatred, madness? These lingering mysteries kept the case alive in the public imagination, feeding curiosity, outrage, and speculation for decades. Soon, Lizzie Borden's story began to take on the qualities of folklore. Her name became shorthand for female transgression. Her story a twisted morality tale whispered in classrooms, parodied in songs, and adapted in literature and film. The infamous jump rope rhyme with its sing-song rhythm and historical inaccuracy, Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks, became a cultural artifact in its own right. It was catchy, morbid, and entirely wrong. Abby had received 19 blows, not 40, and she was Lizzie's stepmother, not biological mother. But accuracy didn't matter. What mattered was the myth, the image of a quiet woman suddenly erupting into unthinkable violence. Hollywood and stage productions soon joined in reshaping the tale. Silent films in the early 20th century drew inspiration from the case, followed by mid-century television dramas, true crime books, and documentaries. Each version painted Lizzie in a different light, some as a misunderstood victim of circumstance, others as a calculating killer. In some tellings, she was the tragic product of Victorian repression. In others, she was a symbol of female rage finally breaking free of its chains. The ambiguity of her guilt gave writers and artists endless room to reinterpret her story, each time reflecting the anxieties and values of their era. The psychological intrigue of the case also appealed to criminologists, historians, and psychologists. Was Lizzie's alleged violence a response to emotional abuse, a mental breakdown, or cold ambition? Could the restrictive environment of the Borden household, its rigid routines, unspoken resentments, and silent wars have festered into something far more sinister? Modern true crime enthusiasts still debate these questions, dissecting the case like a puzzle with missing pieces. In the age of podcasts and YouTube documentaries, Lizzie's story found new life, captivating audiences who saw her not just as a suspect, but as a symbol of the unknown, the unknowable. Even Fall River, the town that once turned its back on Lizzie, eventually embraced its place in the legend. The Borden house was converted into a bed and breakfast, where visitors can tour the murder scene, sleep in Lizzie's bedroom, and even lie on a replica of the blood-stained couch where Andrew was killed. Ghost tours, murder reenactments, and exhibits at local museums all draw on the enduring fascination with the case. The Borden name, once a source of scandal, became a commercial asset. Lizzie in death became what she could never be in life, iconic. Yet beneath all the media adaptations and pop culture echoes lies the core of the tragedy. 2 people were brutally murdered, and no one was ever held accountable. The trial ended in acquittal, but the truth remains unresolved. That uncertainty is what continues to give the story its power. It asks uncomfortable questions about guilt, gender, class, and justice. Questions that don't fade with time. Lizzie Borden may have lived the rest of her life in shadow, but her story endures in the light of every retelling, haunting America's imagination with each chilling whisper of what might have happened in that quiet house on 2nd Street.